Dude, I love spooky season. I love getting cozy and rewatching spooky TV shows, seeing houses decorate and people dress up for Halloween, and I love sitting down and enjoying a good horror movie. Naturally, being a loser, this love of horror also tends to mix with my love of games. I stay up late at night playing or watching people play small little spooky indie games that you can play through in one sitting. And the first game I ever fully completed from start to finish was a horror game. It was Resident Evil 4 on the PS2, and I had to have my dad play through some of the bits because they were too scary for me. This Halloween season had me thinking about my love for horror games, and I started to wonder, what makes horror games scary?
I had to face you, don't recognize. Help me call a doctor, put me inside, put me inside, put me inside, put me inside, put me.
Games can sometimes surprise the player, and as the player is forced to readjust themselves, this momentary shift between an expected calm and a sudden jump leaves them temporarily feeling defenseless. This is typically done by what's known as a jump scare. Weirdly, some of the best and most effective jump scares come from games which aren't even horror games. This is because the player doesn't really expect to get scared, so this makes the shock of the jump scare more jarring. For example, in the first Uncharted game, you go on a typical cheesy action-adventure storyline until you find yourself in an abandoned bunker, alone and isolated. Then, whatever the hell these things are, just decide to come in and be like, nah, you're gonna play a horror game for a while. I also wanted to shout out this random bit in Super Mario 64, where this stupid fucking piano comes to life and starts chasing you. This is a pretty bad jump scare, but it always scared me as a kid when I played this game on the DS. Now, I know they're fun sometimes, but when games are jump scare dependent, it's kind of lazy. It's like if a comedian just started tickling you when their jokes can't make you laugh. Of course, when a sudden thing goes boo, it's your body's natural instinct to flinch, so it's kind of cheap to just rely on that. So what makes a good jump scare? The answer is build up. Instead of just relying on the sudden shock of a jump scare, by building the player's expectations of a sudden scare, a new kind of horror emerges as the player's nervousness and anxiety rises. By having things such as eerie lighting, sound, and other effects, the game can build up the expectation of a scare and let the player sweat in nervousness, with the actual jump scare itself simply being a release of that nervous energy. A good example of a jump scare is found at the very end of Iron Lung. As the submarine the player is in starts slowly filling with the blood that fills the ocean outside, the water fills and the sub creaks and cracks until Speaking of Iron Lung, this is a good time to talk about the second strategy that games can use to be scary. When a player cannot fully grasp what is happening, they are unable to effectively control or calm a situation, leading to a sense of helplessness. As mentioned before, Iron Lung is a great example of using confusion in horror. The player is stuck in a submarine with no windows, and the only way to tell what's going on is the shitty little sensor. So the player has very little knowledge how close they are to crashing and dying, or what creatures lurk right outside the sub. Seeing a new enemy in a Soulsborne game for the first time also creates this feeling of scary confusion. Special mention to the first time I saw that hand spider thing in Elden Ring. When presented by a new grotesque enemy, your first thoughts are often, what the hell is that? And, oh Jesus Christ, I don't know how to kill that thing. This also adds to a sense of disempowerment, another aspect of horror in video games. When the player has no ability to defend themselves, they feel vulnerable and helpless. This is a core part of horror in video games. If we can just beat the shit out of anything that scares us, why should we be scared? At its core, all horror comes from threats. The idea that something is very capable of and willing to hurt you, and you will not be able to stop it. So, what does this look like in video games? The infected fetus scene from Resident Evil 8 is an amazing example of disempowerment in games. So much so that anyone who has played Resident Evil 8 immediately knows which part I'm talking about as soon as I mention it. You spend the whole game building up weapons and gathering resources, but all of that gets taken away from you, and you get dropped into this creepy basement with a replica doll of your dead wife. Eventually, the lights go out, and this abomination starts chasing you, and you are helpless to fight back against it, which leads to one of the scariest moments in the whole franchise. The Amnesia games are also masterclasses at maintaining the feeling of disempowerment, not just in little snippets, but across the whole game. In many of these games, you have no means of fighting back at all throughout the entirety of the game's runtime. This awareness of how useless your character is in combat leads to this sense of vulnerability, even when no enemy is on screen. But a lot of times, once players can grind and get good gear, or they become familiar with the game's mechanics, games end up becoming less scary. For example, a lot of Resident Evil games end up having this pattern where the start of a new section of a game is the scariest, but once you start to learn more about the new location you're in and how the enemies of the area work, you become more able to fight back and therefore feel less scared of the game. A player's spooky experience can probably be summarized by this very professional graph that I made using the most cutting-edge infographic tools. So, as the player builds a better understanding of the game and is better able to face its challenges, how can we maintain the horror? That question brings us to the next part of the video, terror and tension. Terror and tension are the keys to maintaining horror in video games. But first, what even is the difference between terror and horror? Horror is the shock and adrenaline of something scary happening, while terror is the feeling of tension that something scary will happen. This more complex emotion relies on the player's understanding of the dangers that are present and can be maintained by keeping that danger ever present. Mike Klubnica is an indie game dev whose games are great at maintaining tension. His games are only usually a couple minutes long, but they are tense and nail-biting throughout their entire runtime. In his games like Tartarus Engine or Carbon Steel, the player must deal with controls that are finicky and tasks that are hard and time-sensitive. The urgency of the task plus the lack of skill that the player character has puts tension on the player. And this only happens because the player understands what's going on and that something very terrible will happen to them if they fail. The Last of Us is another game that has its terror directly built into understanding the game's mechanics. Once the player figures out that clickers sense the player mainly through sound, the game doesn't become less scary, but instead it becomes a much tenser session of maintaining your silence. The Last of Us also keeps the amount of resources that the player has at a minimum, so that they cannot become too overpowered, which is another very important aspect of horror game design. So, in summary, games can use shock, confusion, and disempowerment to establish fear and build scares for the player. Once that fear is established, it is important to maintain terror and tension by keeping danger present and making sure players don't get too powerful. So, happy Halloween, everyone. I promise this video won't end with a jump scare, so you don't have to worry about that. I'm not just gonna put it in the middle